Though the public seldom hears of them, small and large forces of our Navy are constantly patrolling the seas on specific or routing missions. While Admiral Brown's two-carrier force was smashing the Japanese ships at Lae and Salamaua, some United States cruisers and destroyers were cruising on stations plugging the Sea Gap south of the Solomons. Though on this occasion these cruisers saw no trace of the Japanese, some of the pilots of their scout planes began a period of adventurous action that has no parallel. They encountered dangers on the sea, and some met a whole series of benign, reformed and educated cannibals. One group of them spent 18 days as the guests of the descendants of an old cannibal king, Muyo, on the island of Rossel, which has a black history behind it. 2 of the airmen alighted in a sheltered pool on the afternoon of March 10th. The others alighted on the island on the morning of the 13th. The parties spent several days there before either was aware of the other's presence, and even after the natives had brought reports and finally messages from one party to the other, it was several days more before they finally came together. As a matter of fact, that small force of patrolling cruisers lost, for a time at least, more airplanes than did the Admiral's 2 great carriers in their vicious and destructive attack on the Japanese at Lae and Salamaua. Only 1 scout bomber out of the 108 that took part in the raids on the New Guinea harbours failed to return safely to the Lexington and its companion carrier. The cruisers, however, without sighting a single Japanese, lost 5 scouting seaplanes in a period of 2 days. All 5 of these planes were lost when, for various reasons, the cruisers and aircraft failed to make contact after the planes had left on scouting missions. This was an easy thing to do at sea, where much of the flying is done by dead reckoning, by watching a clock and compass, especially since the scouts are out for as much as 5 hours at a time. Furthermore, they are enjoined to radio silence, lest they reveal their own and their cruisers' position to unfriendly ears. These little scout planes that operate from the cruisers are all equipped with a huge central float and floats at each wingtip. They are small and extremely rugged, designed both for rough water alighting and for catapult takeoffs. Ordinarily, they are fired off from the cruiser's catapult with a charge of gunpowder that in a 90-foot run lifts their speed from 0 to 90 miles an hour. The planes on these cruisers are older types of biplanes with open cockpits, the forward one for the pilot, the after cockpit for the gunner radio man. Their motors are small, 450 horsepower air-cooled radials, and while the plane has sufficient fuel for hours of cruising, its operating speed is slow in comparison to a fighting plane's. Ordinarily, these little stouts fly at about 130 miles an hour. Sometimes they are armed with a light bomb, but their main job is to allow their crews to observe and report observations back to their ships. Pilots of these crafts are really the eyes of the Navy. They enable their captains and superior officers to look out for several hundred miles in all directions. In recent years, these scouts have come to be an absolutely essential arm for all the vessels in the Navy large enough to carry them, some now even being placed on destroyers. In a ship versus ship fight, they spot for their vessels' gunners like observation planes do ashore. Probably the best and most detailed story I got at first hand was that of Ensign William Y. McGowan, a tall, slender young man, clean-cut and alert. He told his tale with a storyteller's appreciation of its high points and humour. McGowan and his radio man, Miller, and the crews of 4 other Seagulls, the little cruiser patrol planes, spent the time on the formerly sinister island of Rossel. His story was related to me as I was bound toward the United States with the rescued crew of the superb old Lexington, following her sinking in the Coral Sea, fighting on May 8th. McGowan's ship had aided in the rescue. The young ensign's tale begins on March 10th, and he tells it about this way. Our cruiser. I may not mention the names of any of the cruisers in this story, because these craft are still active in the Pacific, most of them probably having seen service in the later fleet and air success at Midway Island, fired us off during the forenoon of March 10th. We flew our patrol as instructed, saw nothing, and when the time to pick up our ship had arrived, proceeded to the rendezvous area. To my surprise, there was no sight of it. I then began to fly a searching pattern. Still finding no trace, and having covered a wide area around the rendezvous point, I decided something had delayed the cruiser, so I alighted at once rather than run my fuel tanks dry in the air. We spent several hours drifting and listening on our radio for some indication from our base ship. We heard nothing, and so late in the afternoon decided to take off and fly to the nearest land. This happened to be Rossel. I put the ship down inside the outer coral reef, which practically surrounds the island, and after taking stock of the shore, began taxiing in. Miller assisted by standing on the top wing and pointing out the coral heads to be avoided. We beached on a sand shoal about 60 yards offshore. Not knowing exactly what to expect from the natives, we waited in the plane for some time with our automatic and free machine gun ready. All Navy planes carry a submachine gun for the crews to use in emergency landings of this sort. About 10 minutes after we beached, a group of about 30 natives appeared on the nearby shore. Some waved their arms in what appeared to be a friendly gesture, indicating they were not carrying weapons. We returned the signal and tried to indicate that 2 of them should come out to the plane. About 6 came wading toward us. The natives were short, of rather compact build. Their skin varied in shades from café au lait to a dark chocolate brown. Nearly all wore a rather elaborate 5-pronged long comb in their bushy hair. Many wore a polished bone or shell ornament in their pierced ears and noses, as well as a variety of highly coloured ornaments attached tightly to greatly stretched earlobes. All wore a single skirt-like garment consisting of a piece of cloth secured around the waist with a belt or fold reaching to the knees. Some were crudely tattooed, often wearing their name printed in crude inch-high blue letters across their chests. The leader of this group, Mungi by name, greeted us with a "Hello, Airmen." We were much surprised at this and pleased to learn he spoke a good grade of pidgin English. We talked to him for about 30 minutes and were told there were no white men on the island, no towns, but that there was a mission some distance away. We decided to go there hoping to find someone who could give us information. Mungi balked at first at the idea of leading us there, but after receiving gifts, pencils, paper, and a flashlight lens, he agreed to guide us and furnish boys to carry our gear. At this point I asked McGowan if he knew anything of Rossel's history. He replied that he did not, so I went to the ship's library and found there a magazine I had seen earlier that gave much detail about the island's cannibal days. The writer of the magazine piece had lived on the island for 2 years and pointed out that Rossel had a particularly unsavoury reputation because during the latter end of the last century, the natives captured, annihilated, and ate all except one of 327 shipwrecked Chinese. Many other instances of cannibalism were attributed to these Rossel tribes. The banqueting on the Chinese was carried out by King Muyo. The wretched victims were aboard the French ship St. Paul, which was wrecked on the reef bordering the island in 1858. The captain and 8 of the crew left in a small boat for New Caledonia to get assistance. But aid did not get back to Rossel until 4 months later. Then the French warship the Styx called. Its officers found only 1 Chinaman alive to tell what happened, and his story was that Muyo had put all 326 of his countrymen on a barren coral at just off the main shore. He provided food and water for their sustenance, but whenever he held a feast for his tribe, which was often, he brought over a number of the Chinese to provide the pièce de résistance, until soon only 1 remained. The last instance of annihilating a white man occurred in 1892. The victim, Lucien Fiolini, an escapee from the French penal colony of New Caledonia, reached Rossel in a small craft from the Isle of Nu. When the natives were asked why they annihilated him, they gave as reason: he caused disharmony in the community through his assiduous attentions to the women of the tribe. The article described the island, easternmost of the Louisiade archipelago, as volcanic, rugged, and mountainous. It is about 20 miles long by 10 wide. Waters around it are treacherous. The native population consists of about 1,200 men, women, and children. The writer described the island as infested with crocodiles, snakes, scorpions, mosquitoes, and sandflies. The forests contain hundreds of beautiful orchids and other blooms rare to civilization. "I did not know a bit of this," McGowan laughed when we finished reading the piece. "I am glad I did not at the time. I was suspicious enough of the natives as it was, until they unmistakably showed us they were friendly. If I had read the piece beforehand, I might have felt worse." The boys moored their plane, dismantled the machine guns, and toted the ammunition ashore. Then they took out parachutes, rations, canteens, machine guns, very pistols, and had the natives carry them up to a nearby house. The codes and chartboard were burned and destroyed. McGowan went on to describe the trip to the mission. He and Miller took only their pistols, smoke grenades, and canteens, and began a walk of 6 or 7 miles that took them 4 hours. In his own words, we had to proceed quite slowly, at times having to watch each step to avoid spraining or breaking an ankle as the roots and rocks were so slippery it was hard to obtain solid footing. We were welcomed at the mission by Satapan, the native missionary. He explained to us in Pidgin that he and 3 other missionaries on the island had come over from Missima, 100 miles to the north-northwest. Then he gave us a very good dinner consisting of delicious ripe bananas, fried pumpkin, boiled chicken, boiled yams and potatoes. We did very well by this repast, as we had not eaten since breakfast at 5 a.m. that morning. After dinner, McGowan asked Satapan if he had a map. I still remember the way McGowan's eyes went round as he told of his utter amazement when Satapan produced an upper air chart of the Southern Pacific, United States Navy Hydrographic Office publication. "You cannot possibly guess where Satapan got that map," McGowan grinned. "He got it by way of a bottle. Yes, really. He found a bottle on the beach one day with a note in English in it. It had been dropped into the ocean thousands of miles from there by some American hydrographer. Satapan sent this man a letter telling him where he found the bottle, and the hydrographer sent him back the map as thanks. Of course it was a godsend to us, for we could not have gotten a better map for our purposes." McGowan and Miller returned to their planes next day and spent the daylight hours trying to raise any United Nations forces on their transmitter. There were no results. All they got was news, broadcast from Sydney. Meanwhile, they stripped down the plane, taking out all possible gear, compass, clocks, etc. At that time, they had in mind the possibility of making a sea trip to New Guinea in a native boat, but fortunately never tried it. The second afternoon, McGowan continued, was spent bathing in a creek near Satapan's mission with the same supposed cannibals with whom he had been ready to do battle when he arrived at Rossel. Discussions with them over the possibilities of getting out of their predicament followed, the young ensign recalled in about this pattern. "I would ask a question in English, addressing Mungi. It would be a simple question such as, 'Could we slay a chicken for dinner tonight?' Mungi would turn to the others, deliver a brief exhortation, and then pause dramatically. Instantly there would be a tremendous uproar from the 25 or 30 native men gathered around. Some would frown and shout, others would wave their hands wildly while talking at the tops of their voices. This would continue for a couple of minutes. Suddenly there would be a silence. Mungi would turn back and in English reply, 'Yes.' I always wondered what in the world they all found to say on such unimportant matters as we brought up. On March 13th, while on the way to look at a native canoe, they were considering the chance of making a voyage to Missima, where 2 Americans were reported to be operating a gold mine. They were met by a native boy who said that 4 very large airplanes had landed on the other side of the island. "We thought this was just a tall tale told in the hope of getting presents," McGowan goes on. Later, however, another boy came with exactly the same story. This time the planes were described as exactly like our own. I became practically sure the planes were from some United States cruisers, especially when the native described their wing insignia, so I wrote a note to the crews. It so happened that the 4 planes were from American cruisers. Their crews consisted of Lieutenant J.M. Brandt, Arid Ensigns Leland L. Wilder, John H. Graves, and Joseph B. Young, with radiomen Home, Lucas, Hewlegard, and Owen. They too had missed a rendezvous with their ships on March 12th. The 4 planes met at the rendezvous and finally alighted when the cruisers did not appear. They drifted all night on the open, choppy sea in an 18-knot wind. Lieutenant Brandt described this. Our rations and lifeboat were placed in a readily accessible position, because it seemed that at any moment the plane would capsize or wrench apart. Almost immediately on landing, Lucas and I became very seasick and were both intensely thirsty from the heat of the sun and engine during flight. We each had 2 malted milk tablets for supper with a small sip of water. During the night, Brandt's plane drifted close to one of the other 3 in the group, and they were able to discuss their plight back and forth from cockpit to cockpit. They decided it would be permissible to send off a radio message next morning telling where they were going to sit down. They considered waiting on the water one day longer in the hope that the cruisers would hunt for them, but the planes were getting too much of a beating. "Every few minutes," Brandt said, A wave would wash over one wing, and the swirling water would twist the wing structure and put a tremendous force on the wingtip floats. About midnight, the plane slid backwards down the front of a wave, dug the tail into the back of the next wave, and the water folded the port elevator down under the horizontal stabilizer and against the stabilizer strut. At daylight next morning on March 13th, I crawled back on the stabilizer and straightened the elevator as best I could by hand. As the sun rose, we could see one plane a mile behind us, and the other two about 5 miles ahead. At 6:15 I took off, and the plane handled surprisingly well in the rough sea and with only one elevator in operation. In the air, the lieutenant sent his radio message and listened for 10 minutes. There was no answer. The other planes then took off, and all four flew to Rossel, 130 miles away. They circled the island and finally alighted in a small bay near a deserted copra plantation after making a survey for enemies, a town, or for a probable place of shelter. A few natives in red loincloths, an occasional village consisting of 3 or 4 grass shacks, and a small herd of cattle was sighted in a coconut grove before we alighted. Brant continued. The plantation belonged to a Mr. Osborne and his wife, the only whites who had been living on the island. They had left in January, natives told the young airman. The house, a red-roofed, comfortable bungalow, stood on a hill 250 feet above the plantation. Leaving 4 men to guard the planes, the other 4 of us set out to look for fresh water that seemed of paramount importance at that time, Brant said. We found it, fresh rainwater, at the house, and by the time we got back to the plains, several natives had gathered. From them, we heard that 3 days earlier, another plane had landed on the island just around the point. The airmen learned later that the natives have no ideas of distance. A journey which they say will require only a few hours of walking might take days. At any rate, Ensign Wilder's plane was partly refueled from all the other tanks, and he was sent over to investigate Tagula, 25 miles distant. Wilder was soon back, having been frightened off by the appearance of natives in a large war canoe. Coming back from Tagula, his ship ran out of fuel just after he alighted at the entrance to the bay. He had to paddle ashore. During the afternoon, Brant and another pilot started out with guides to find the other flyers about whom the natives talked, but were near collapse after an hour's walk through jungle swamps, streams, and up and down almost vertical rocky trails. They wrote a note and sent native runners ahead to McGowan and Miller, and then started back to their planes. Toward dusk, the airmen walked to Osborne's house to survey the food situation, as Brant said. Osborne had evidently foreseen the possibility of aviators being stranded on the island. He had left word with the natives that he might never be back, and for them to help any white aviators in trouble. We found that he had 15 or 20 head of cattle, 15 ducks, 7 or 8 chickens, and a turkey. We also heard from the natives Osborne's 28-ton boat, the Yellow Gili, was hidden in a bay on the other side of the island. When we made this discovery, we decided to eat off the land and save all canned rations from the aircraft for a possible boat trip to Cookstown or Townsville. At the house, we were amazed to find that a native named Tapi, who was apparently Osborne's houseboy and right-hand man, had laid out mattresses on the bunks and was in the process of spreading sheets on each mattress. He brewed some tea and broiled up a chicken that was as tough as rubber, but the broth was good. The house also contained a small bag of sugar, a bag of tea, 2 pounds of flour, 1-quart jar of tapioca, 3 jars of sago, and a bag of salt. One of the flyers remarked later he was absolutely astonished to find Osborne's belongings, and particularly his food and stock untouched by the natives, although he already had been gone for weeks. The native boys refused to touch this food at any time, living entirely off their own produce, fishing, or their own fowl. Evidently, the missionaries or Osborne had instilled in them a real sense of respect for a white man's property. On the 14th, there were hard tropical rains all day. We had asked the other pilots, whom we had decided were McGowan and Miller, to meet us at Osborne's house in the note we had sent on. When they did not appear, we concluded they had either not received the message or had also heard of the Yellow Gili and were travelling toward it. It was decided that 2 pairs of us would start around the island in opposite directions, hoping to find McGowan. Graves relieved Tapi of the cooking and served us up some dumplings with leftovers of the chicken, Brant added. The morning of the 15th, Wilder and Brant started out on what was to be a grueling 5-day trek. On this day, which was Sunday, They were dumbfounded to have their native boy Tappy inform them after a short walk that he would rather not work on the Sabbath day. He got 2 other boys to lead them on, however. By dark, they had not arrived at the mission where McGowan was supposed to be, so they sent a messenger on with a note to ask the other 2 airmen to wait for them, and above all not to set off in the Yellow Gilly before the 8 men from Osborne's could be taken aboard. The messenger was sent off in the dark with a flashlight and a $1 bill as a present. We learned later that he located McGowan about 1 a.m. the following morning at another mission house further along the north coast. Wilder and I stayed in a little grass hut set up on poles 6 feet off the ground, Brant went on. The natives feasted us on coconut and a boiled green banana each. 2 of them insisted on sleeping across the doorway to protect us. On another occasion on this trip, when the mosquitoes were very bad at night, we were astonished to awaken about 2 a.m. and find that one of our native boys was staying up all night to keep a fire going and smoke drifting into our hut to keep the mosquitoes away from us. On March 16th, they arrived at Satapan's mission, found definite proof of McGowan's presence in some of the things he had left behind. Satapan also told Brant, "McGowan left for the Yellow Gilly 2 days before, and you should reach him in 2 hours." Brant said he and Wilder were not able to decide whether this remark was a reflection on McGowan's jungle speed or downright flattery of us. We were travelling with our feet in bandages and going very slowly. On the 17th of March, they reached the Yellow Gilly to find it a most seaworthy little schooner with 2 diesel engines, each on a separate shaft, and on deck 4 55-gallon drums of diesel oil. The boat was 65 to 70 feet long. Nogo, its captain, received the boys with faint hospitality. Brant wrote in his official report of these incidents, and a short talk with him disclosed the following information. 1. Nogo had a hangover from chewing too much betel nut. 2. He would go ashore and get some kai-kai food and the native engineer. 3. He was the first native we encountered who seemed unfriendly, evidently, because he feared we were going to steal his boat, which was almost correct, but we had offered him several inducements. 4. From a chart of the island we found on the boat, we discovered we had travelled 3/4 of the way around in the wrong direction. If we had gone the right way, we would have found the boat in 1 day, instead of 5. Brant and Wilder stayed 1 day on the boat, and on March 18th they had decided to seize the boat if necessary and prepare it to make the voyage to Australia. Shortly after noon, Brant relates, a very odd coincidence occurred. I was sitting daydreaming about being rescued. I was planning in my mind just what I would do if I suddenly saw a rescue plane in the sky. I would rip off my skivvy shirt and tie it to a pole that was at my side. Then I would climb up the mast and at the same time call to Wilder, who was in the cabin, to bring a mirror that was stowed in a cubbyhole there. I was so engrossed in my thoughts that when a patrol bomber did appear at that instant over the mountain, it seemed the natural thing to happen, and I was hardly taken aback by surprise. I carried out my little plan, and Wilder came up with an Australian flag in addition to the mirror. Either the mirror attracted the pilot's attention while he was about 7 miles away, or he spotted the boat, for he turned 90 degrees from his course and headed directly for us. He made another turn 200 feet above the boat, and then continued on out of sight. We were dumbfounded as well as broken-hearted, for the pilot made no sign of recognition or acknowledgement. We hoped he might have stopped on the other side of the island to pick up the rest of our party and would return for us next day. On the other hand, we thought, what if he saw the Australian flag and our long beards and thought we were just 2 old copra traders who did not want to get bombed? We learned later that our second thought was correct. Wilder, telling of this later, said that Nogo, the captain, never reappeared, but he did send them 2 helpers, one of whom, Tom by name, came out 3 times daily and boiled up a mess of rice, coconut and squash. This, with a few bananas and oranges, was our steady diet for 3 days, and we were very grateful for it despite the fact that we had to snap a worm out of the rice every now and again. During the next 2 days they received messages from the boys at Osborne's house, saying that a Catalina skippered by Squadron Leader F.B. Chapman of the Royal Australian Air Force had found them, and that repair crews were being brought so the planes could be refueled, checked and flown out. A day later, by Dingy, a mountain trail, a canoe trip down a river, and finally an outrigger ocean canoe, they reached the Osborne plantation. During the trials of Brant and Wilder, our friends Lieutenant McGowan and Miller had reached the Yellow Gilly, decided it was a good seaworthy boat, and then trekked right onto Osborne's place, where they joined the 6 men who had remained there. McGowan described the journey thus. We climbed mountainsides that seemed to be very nearly vertical, waded through alligator-infested swamps, sometimes shoulder-deep in the water and knee-deep in the mud. After several hours of this, our path led out onto the shore along the beach on the southern coast of the island. While we were walking along the beach, we spotted a PBY flying an easterly course paralleling our route. Though we signalled with a very pistol, he failed to spot us. We learned later this plane was a Royal Australian Air Force Catalina searching the reef for evidence of our seaplanes. When he went by, we felt a little sunk, but not too badly, as this was the first indication that patrols were covering the island, and we hoped that he would see the planes on the beach at Osborne's place. We made the last part of the trip by outrigger canoe, paddling about 3 miles along the coast. McGowan said he found Osborne's house about what he had expected from the native's description, an iron-roofed substantial frame house on a hillside overlooking a 60-acre coconut grove. Half an hour later, and after they had exchanged greetings with the 6 men, he and Miller were served a meal of rump roast and potatoes with salt, which was just about the most tasty I ever enjoyed. Graves and his party had slain one of Osborne's cattle the day before. Next morning the men were lounging near Osborne's house when Tappy was sent up a tree to catch them coconut. Tapy shouted that he heard an airplane. We could hear nothing, but taking no chances of again missing the plane, we got our pyrotechnic gear ready for signalling. Tapy kept saying he heard a plane and pointed northward in the direction of the hill behind us. About 15 minutes had passed by when suddenly a PBY came roaring down the coastline at an altitude of about 100 feet. We set off our smoke grenades and fired our very stars, giving him a real fireworks display. Almost at once he turned inland and flew directly over us. We then signalled him with our blinker lights, and shortly after, he landed in the lagoon directly offshore from us. While he was circling, Graves and I ran down to the beach, got one of our seaplanes started, and as soon as he landed, we taxied out to where the Catalina was anchored. McGowan, Young, and the 4 radio men rode over to Tulagi in the Catalina. There, the decision was made to fly in gasoline and repair crews so that the Seagulls could be flown out. McGowan and Young came back on the 21st with a crew of half a dozen Australian mechanics and 1 officer, having left the 4 radio men in Tulagi for minor medical treatment. During the next week, the work of examining all the planes, checking engines and making repairs to Brandt's elevators was carried out. The Aussies came out with tools, but virtually no materials. When they needed rivets, they took a piece of copper tubing and sliced strips out of it. From these strips they cut rivets that served their purposes very well. They also showed ingenuity in handling 2 of the engines which were dismantled, and in finding ways and means of re-rigging the biplane wings. All in all, the Aussies impressed the pilots with their ability to find makeshift means of doing any job required. During this time we lived well, Brandt told me later. Our food consisted of vegetables brought in by the natives in exchange for the meat we gave them from 2 cows we slaughtered. Each time we slew a cow, we cooked up a quarter of it and gave the rest to them. We had to eat our meat in 2 days, otherwise it spoiled in the heat. Besides the veal, we prepared and ate 6 chickens, 6 ducks, the one and only turkey, and 2 large fish we caught off the reef. On the 27th, a short Sunderland, a big 4-engine flying boat, came in from Port Moresby with part of the gasoline required and a lot of food for the men. The rest of the gasoline was scheduled to come in by flying boat from Australia. That same day, the 4 radio men who had gone to Tulagi for medical attention came back in a Catalina, and were all sent to Port Moresby in the Sunderland. In their place, the pilots kept 4 Australian mechanics plus Miller, who stayed with McGowan. The officers on the Sunderland also brought the pilots directions to fly their airplanes out to Port Moresby, Townsville, Brisbane, and finally to Sydney. The airmen were overjoyed at the prospect of getting to a big city, and in fact were jubilant over the chance. Only a little more fuel was needed to allow them to start the 440-mile trip to Port Moresby. While they were sitting down to breakfast on the morning of the 28th, 2 cruiser seaplanes from their own striking force arrived at the cove. At this point, they were really unwelcome visitors, for they carried an invitation to the beachcombing airmen to come back to work. And so our castaways bade farewell to the Australians who returned to their base. Our own pilots shortly afterward flew the 5 planes back to their own ships, arriving aboard in time for lunch. What the pilots really thought about this sudden change of plans was expressed in the plaintive note attached to the end of Lieutenant Brandt's written report. He closed, "We had to return without our radio men, but they had a wonderful month's vacation in Australia." Toward the end of April, the Navy began to receive reports from long-range planes based in Australasia and from our submarines that indicated the Japanese were preparing for a move of some sort in northern Australian waters. In spite of our destruction of Japanese shipping at Lae and Salamaua, and the constant pounding of Rabaul and other New Guinea harbours by army bombers from northern Australia during the preceding 7 weeks, the enemy was building up troops, equipment, transports and navy forces in these areas. It was clear to anyone who had access to our reconnaissance reports that they were getting ready to make another southward thrust. Although we did not understand their full plan of action at the time, later events showed they had apparently worked out an involved program that included movements of 4 powerful sea fleets, 2 of them striking units with aircraft carriers as their chief weapons, and 2 occupation forces. Although this is ignoring the proper chronology of the action, I want to tell at this stage what a reconstruction of the events showed the Japanese plans to be. This reconstruction was not made until after the final Coral-Sea battles, in which we decisively smashed 3 of the fleets, in fighting that spread over 5 days and more than 100,000 square miles of sea. We believe now that the Japanese striking forces came out of Truk, which is equivalent in importance and permanence to our own Pearl Harbor. Both these forces were led by aircraft carriers, there being at least 4 and probably 5 of their largest and newest types. The smaller striking force was a prong that started directly south from Truk toward the southeastern tip of New Guinea. It most likely was intended to seize and hold the Jomard Straits, the only deep water passage into the Coral Sea between that tip of New Guinea and the Louisiade. 2 carriers, 5 cruisers and a dozen destroyers formed this arm. The importance of holding the Jomard Straits can be seen in a glance at the maps inside the cover. Whoever does not hold this passage must route its transports, supply lines and reinforcing elements at least 700 miles around the coral-girt Louisiade. But in order to do the job in a thorough manner, the Japanese did not depend on this first prong alone. They sent a second and larger force consisting of 3 carriers, 3 battleships, a number of cruisers and more than a dozen destroyers, in a long looping southeastward sweep that passed into the Coral Sea between the Solomon Group and New Hebrides, and then curled back in a northwest direction toward the Jomard Passage from the south. These 2 powerful spearheads were expected to protect, proceed and prepare the way for the invasion forces. These were gathered in 2 concentrations. The first was at Deboyne Island, just north of the Jomard Passage. The second was in the harbour of Tulagi, on the island of Florida in the British Solomons. Each of the occupation outfits consisted of a number of cruisers and destroyers, seaplane tenders, transports, troopships, supply vessels and fleet auxiliaries. Command on the Lexington at this time had shifted from Vice Admiral Wilson Brown, Jr., to Rear Admiral Aubrey Fitch, and the Lexington's force, 1 carrier, several cruisers and destroyers, had rejoined a similar 1 carrier unit that was commanded by Vice Admiral Frank J. Fletcher. Being the senior officer made Admiral Fletcher commander-in-chief of the whole carrier striking force. The junction of these forces came about April 30th. On that day, 2 of the Lexington's scout planes surprised a Japanese submarine on the surface. They dived on it and dropped 3 bombs. Although the pilots believed the sub was sunk, they could report only that a huge patch of fuel oil spread over the ocean after it crash-dived. This was the Lexington's first brush with the enemy in several weeks. During this period, the ship had been refueled, new stores of all kinds been put aboard, the crew had been given a few days ashore, new pilots and new airplanes had been added to the ship's main batteries, its air squadrons, and a large number of brand-new recruits had been poured into its various departments. These recruits, freshly enlisted and just out of the naval training centres, comprised about 20% of the total complement. We were a confident crowd, ready and anxious for more action. We had already felt out the Japanese and found them far from the supermen their victorious East Indies campaigns had suggested them to be, and now our constant aerial patrols began to bring in information that told all the old hands action was not far off. Their almost daily report told of seeing Japanese snooper planes ranging the area. Usually our scouts would be from 150 to 200 miles out from the Lexington flotilla when they sighted these snoopers. Their presence indicated the enemy was interested in the waters into which we were steaming. Besides increasing the vigilance of everyone aboard, these reports acted as a wonderful tonic for the morale of the crew. Weeks of inaction had tended to take the fun out of their constant practice and study, and the unchanging daily routine had become monotonous. Even the pilots, who had to work hard all the time, were spoiling for a fight. Word of the Japanese presence raised their spirits, just as the sight of his quarry's spoor quickens the big game hunter's pulse. I began to spend a lot of my time in the Lexington's radio room, where I was learning the routines of the airmen aloft when they communicate with each other, or with the fighter director, the central radio control for all the Lexington's airplanes. The various airplane circuits were connected to amplified loudspeakers in the radio control room, and sitting in comfort I could hear the pilots out on their patrols far over the horizon. Much of this conversation, when the airmen were at extreme ranges, was too dim and blurred by static to be understandable. But when the planes were closer in, we could hear every word the pilots said, and when I closed my eyes and followed some conversation, I had the sensation of being in the airplanes with them. In the beginning, it took me some time to be able to interpret what I heard, because almost everything was said in code that consisted largely of Navy flyers' slang. Each scout or each pair of fighters when in the air were identified by girls' names. For instance, Lieutenant Commander Paul Ramsey and his wingman might use Agnes. Other names the pilots perhaps fancied were Lily, Katie, Mabel, and Joan. Listening to the radio conversations, one would hear remarks like, Agnes to Lily. A plane at 17,000, bearing 1305 miles, having a look. Lily acknowledged, we'll be around. An enemy formation report would instantly bring a call to battle stations, and immediately afterward the carrier would take over radio direction of its own scouts. When identifying aircraft, the pilots, if possible, would name the type of Japanese planes, calling them Mitsubishis, Nakajima, Zeros, and Kawanishis, to indicate the probable type of mission they might be on. The reason the pilots were allowed to talk freely to one another in the air, or back to the carrier under certain conditions, was that in these conversations only a limited amount of transmitter power was used. Most of the time the range of these interplane conversations was barely to the horizon. All the planes carried in addition long-range transmitters that could be used to talk over a distance up to several hundred miles. Most of the conversations I heard in the radio room, however, came in on the low-power circuits and had to be greatly amplified for us to understand them at all. Our double carrier force was moving northward toward the Solomons on the afternoon of May 3rd, when one of our far-flung scouts located a concentration of enemy shipping in Tulagi harbor. We did not know then that the two-pronged striking forces were on their way north, where the Japanese invasion fleets were going to concentrate. That first report came in by radio this way, Joan to carrier, concentration enemy shipping Tulagi harbor. The scout used his high-powered long-range transmitter for just this one message. His job was done, even though Japanese might catch him and shoot him down. As it happened, they did not. This pilot made his observation cautiously and successfully used the towering cumulus clouds that fill the skies in these areas day and night for cover. The result was that apparently the Japanese never saw him at all, never suspected his presence, and consequently were unwarned that our carriers were in the vicinity. The pilot came back late that afternoon and made his full report first to his air officer and then directly to Admiral Fletcher. We continued our normal cruising until dark. Then, as soon as the brief twilight had faded, the fleet turned and commenced a high-speed run directly toward the island of Florida. This indicated to every man in the flotilla that they were heading for trouble and going in to force battle on the enemy. Dinner was quickly finished that night, and as soon as the dishes were cleared by the messroom attendants, a general pilot meeting of all air squadrons was held. First, the particulars of the Solomon Islands, and specifically of Tulagi harbor, were dug out. Sailing directions for the Pacific Islands, Volume 1, United States Navy Department, Hydrographic Office, says as follows: The Solomon Islands lie between the New Hebrides and the Bismarck Archipelago, and extend over an area 600 miles long in a northwest and southeast direction and up to 100 miles wide. They consist of a double row of large mountainous islands attaining heights as in the case of Guadalcanal and Bougainville, of 8,000 and 10,000 feet. In addition, there are a great number of smaller islands and small coral islets. In appearance, the islands present many similar characteristics, consisting of a chain of lofty mountains for the most part, covered with dense forests and rank undergrowth, here and there giving place to long grass and ferns. The slopes incline gently to the sea, and the shores are lined with mangroves in places. The larger islands are well watered by numerous streams at the mouths of which, as well as on the swamps and sandy shores of uninhabited coral islets, crocodiles abound. Some of these islands are entirely of volcanic formation, while others are calcareous, but there are also many cases in which both these formations are combined. The same Standard Seaman's Reference Book says of Florida Island, "This is the largest of a group of volcanic islands lying to the westward of Maleta Island. It attains an elevation of about 1,366 feet and is well wooded, with occasional grassy tracts bare of trees. This variety of surface, presented by sharp peaks and rounded hills, and apparent want of order in their features, affords a pleasing contrast to some of the other islands. It consists of 2 islands of a combined length of about 22 miles, in a west-northwest and opposite direction, separated by a narrow channel Utah Passage. Olavuga, Buena Vista, and several other small islands lie northwestward of Florida Island. The eastern portion of Florida Island lies some 13 miles northward of Guadalcanal Island, there being numerous shoal patches and reefs between them. 3 deep channels run through this foul ground, namely Ingala, Sea Lark, and Lengo channels. Westward of Tulagi Harbour there are no off-lying dangers. The 100-fathom curve runs parallel with the coast about 3 miles offshore, the general depth across to the Guadalcanal coast being from 200 to 400 fathoms. Tulagi Harbour, the principal port and seat of government of the British Solomon Islands Protectorate, is situated about midway along the southern coast of Florida Island. The island is well populated, and the inhabitants are quiet but lazy. The villages are large and built chiefly on the slopes of the hills. Tulagi is only a tiny settlement, and the only representatives of Great Britain there are a resident administrator and a dozen native police. It was undefended, and its only asset was a wharf where a small island steamer from Sydney called every 6 weeks to pick up copra gathered from surrounding plantations and to drop supplies for the 300 to 400 whites who lived in the Solomon Group. The Japanese had moved in there without opposition only a few days before. The pilots were given all this information, plus photographic copies of maps showing the harbour and the surrounding islands. Their attention was called to Guadalcanal Island because the plan for attack would send them right up over the island in their flight to Tulagi. Information available indicated that Guadalcanal is 70 miles long, extending almost due east and west by 50 miles wide. The terrain is densely wooded and mountainous, with peaks ranging up to 6,000 feet. On its northern shores there are 12 to 14 large coconut plantations, mostly owned by overseas companies with only a white overseer in residence. Admiral Fletcher proposed to move the carriers in close to Guadalcanal during the night. One stood in near shore whence its planes could be launched against Tulagi Harbour. The other carrier remained at sea where its air squadrons were available as reinforcements if needed, and principally as a guard against the Japanese launching a surprise rear attack from carriers possibly in this area. The airmen were told that they would come down out of the mountains onto the Japanese, so that they could remain hidden by the peaks until within 12 miles of the harbour. Our scout pilot had been able to count 15 vessels in the harbour. He was certain they included 3 cruisers and some destroyers. The rest were a miscellany, he reported. After a general conference, each squadron had its own meeting. Timing, direction and flying speed, as well as fuel and bomb loads were given out. Everyone was told that the carrier would be in position to launch by dawn, and it was suggested that everyone hit the hay early, and the young pilots, knowing that they must be at their best in the morning, turned in quietly and went to sleep. I gleaned the story of what happened during the attack from flyers who participated in the combat. The events of the next few hours are better told in their own words. Everyone on the ship was awakened and summoned to his battle station by the general quarters gong and trumpet call, long before dawn the morning of May 4th. We had always stood dawn and dusk battle stations, but now we were going to launch a blow ourselves, and instead of a mere precaution, this time it had a vital meaning. No land was in sight. The ships were still speeding over a starlit sea. Nevertheless, the airplane crews were warming up engines, and pilots were pulling on their gear in the ready room or getting their breakfasts in the wardroom. "We are coming in close to Guadalcanal," the pilots were told, "and from the point where you will take off, it will be a 120-mile flight due north to Tulagi Harbour. Do not forget the heights of those Guadalcanal peaks. It will still be dark by the time you are coming in close there, so give them plenty of clearance." The attacking planes were launched at 6:15 a.m., the first group being 18 Douglas SBDs. These were followed in a matter of seconds by the same number of heavy dive bombers, Douglas BDs, each carrying one 1,000-pound bomb. Last off, a few minutes behind the leading scouts, were 18 Douglas TBDs, torpedo bombers, 3 placecraft, each carrying a 21-inch, almost 2,000-pound torpedo. The scouts spread out in pairs and beat a swift patrol for 50 miles over the sea in all directions around Florida, Guadalcanal, and Malaita Islands, without going near Tulagi Harbour. This was done as a precaution against the possible arrival in the area during the hours of darkness of an enemy carrier. The night that had hidden our own approach might also have blanketed an oncoming enemy fleet. None was found, however, and the scouts returned to join up with the dive bombers at 15,000 feet as they approached Tulagi. These scouts were each carrying one 500-pound bomb, and when their scouting duties were completed, they became light dive bombers, inasmuch as their planes were identical in every way with the heavy dive-bombing craft. The torpedo planes, flying at 160 knots, climbed barely high enough to get over Guadalcanal's 6,000-foot peaks. The sun's first rays flashed off their wings as they passed over the jungle gorges and the rocky heights. Then they pushed their noses down in a screaming dive to get back to water level and into the proper position for launching their tin fish. Their approach had been so timed that as they flashed out across the 12-mile-wide channel separating Tulagi Harbour from Guadalcanal, the dive bombers were just arriving in position overhead. "You take them low and we will take them high," Lieutenant Commander William O. Birch, leader of the dive bombers, said over his command radio to the torpedo planes as the attack commenced. This attack had come so unexpectedly that there were no Japanese crews at the anti-aircraft guns. Literally, the first warning was the low drone of motors coming across the water, mingling with the high-pitched, throaty roar of the first dive bomber coming out of the heavens. "We found that harbour a busy place," one of the dive bomber pilots reported when he returned to the carrier an hour and a half after his takeoff. "Everything was in there, from cruisers to rafts. Lighters were carrying troops and equipment from the troopships to the shore. One of those troopships was at least a 20,000-tonner, and the others in the 6,000 to 8,000-ton class." Before the dives began from the 3-mile height, specific targets were assigned to individual pilots by their squadron leaders. The largest transport, the 3 cruisers, one being a heavy cruiser type, the 3 destroyers alongside a seaplane tender, and another destroyer anchored alone were marked for first attacks. "Down we came," another pilot put in. "Not a gun was fired, and we had sitting targets. The only annoyance was the fogging of my sights as I went through a warm layer of atmosphere on the way in. We could not miss. We held the dives to 1,000 feet, dropped our stuff, and were away before the first guns opened on us." Sitting back on the carrier with the ship's officers and the fighter pilots who did not go out with the first waves, one heard over the intercom the calm voices of the squadron leaders selecting targets and announcing that they were on their ways. Static and motor noise from the fighting planes' radios was so great that one could not tell when they ended their dives. The first pilots back to the ship, however, told what they had seen. "That whole harbour was being churned up when I looked last," one of them said. "There were huge columns of smoke, water and debris, and the sound of heavy explosions could be heard above our engines. Just as I was leaving, the torpedo planes were coming in low and fanned out. I could see the white trails of their torpedo wakes all over the harbour. I saw 2 torpedoes explode against a ship, and the resulting blast and water splashes completely hid it. 2 others that missed ships went off on the beach. There was complete hell in that harbour, and the Japanese were running to cover. At least 2 heavy bombs fell smack on the deck of the heavy cruiser," the last of the dive bomber pilots related. Huge flames licked 200 feet into the air, and the ship staggered under the impact. It began to settle at once. Explosions amongst the smaller craft tossed lighters into the air, spilled men into the water, and shattered to splinters the light wooden auxiliary vessels. Torpedoes struck the grouped seaplane tender and the 3 destroyers. When the smoke cleared away, one destroyer already was underwater, a second was turning over, and the tender was seen to be in trouble. An alert scout plane pilot, having dropped his little 500-pound bomb, saw a Japanese seaplane fighter take off from one end of the harbour. Diving on the seaplane, he opened fire and loosed 100 rounds of ammunition. The Japanese plane went into a slipping dive and crashed. Then the same pilot noted 5 other seaplanes moored close ashore and shot them up too in a series of diving runs up and down their line. The pilots reformed into squadrons as the last of their bombs, torpedoes and ammunition was exhausted, and when noses were counted, they found that not one was missing. The carrier had continued to steam in closer to Guadalcanal while the planes were fighting, so the return journey for the flyers was only a little more than 80 miles, or about half an hour's flight. The formations were as tight and as full when they came in sight as when they left. The pilots broke into the landing circle, came out of the formation one at a time and alighted, hot, thirsty and happy. But the first men back demanded the utmost speed in refueling, rearming and rebombing their planes. They said that while much damage had been done, some of the Japanese warships had steamed up, had slipped their anchors and fled to sea. They wanted to return and get the entire bag, as one squadron leader put it. The group was ready to go back into the air by 11 a.m. when 54 planes took off. As they crossed Guadalcanal, they fanned out over the waters surrounding Florida to hunt down the fleeing Japanese vessels, while others went to finish the work in the harbour. Maisie to carrier came a call from a dive bomber squadron leader 20 minutes after the second takeoff. "You should see this harbour. Ships damaged in the first raid have now sunk or run ashore and are burning. The seaplane tender and destroyers have disappeared, sunk. One cruiser and a transporter just leaving the harbour. We will take them." The planes caught the 2 in the harbour mouth. Direct hits seen by more than a dozen pilots and heavy bombs that exploded in the water close beside it sank the transport in a matter of seconds. The cruiser was hit astern, came to a stop and appeared to settle. Anti-aircraft fire from shore installations and from a destroyer and a cruiser that had gotten away to sea and were steaming parallel to one another with an interval of about 3 miles between them was heavy. Down the squadrons went in a combined torpedo and dive bombing attack. Both vessels went into what the pilots call their snake dance, zigzagging and twisting. 6 TBDs dropped their fish, but the cruiser avoided these by making a quick turn after the missiles had been dropped. All 6 churned on parallel to the Japanese ship without hitting it, but the dive bombers went screaming down on the same vessel as it held its straight course to avoid the torpedoes just then passing up its sides and paralleling its course. 7 heavy bombs dropped on and beside it, where they had the effect of mines on the hull. It lost way and began to heel over. Part of the reason for the failure of the torpedo plane attack was the bold interference of a Japanese seaplane fighter. Its pilot dived in amongst the torpedo planes, turning and firing in all directions to divert them. Several scouts pounced on the Japanese plane, but found it so maneuverable and so well flown that although they were 3-1, the unequal fight went on for minutes before a burst of fire finally downed it. This Japanese plane crash-landed near an island. The pilot tried to climb out of his cockpit but slumped dead or unconscious. The rear gunner jumped overboard and was last seen making a strong wake as he sped ashore in what was unquestionably world swimming record time. Returning for the second time to the carrier, the pilots considered their job not yet completed. They complained of the seaplane fighter interference and reported some Japanese ships still in the harbour as not yet sunk. Lunch was served to them while the planes were serviced for the 3rd time that day, and again at 3:30 p.m., 18 dive bombers escorted for the first time by 2 teams of 2 fighters each were launched to finish the work. This time no torpedo planes were sent off. 6 of the bombers caught a damaged cruiser just outside the harbour mouth and sank her. The other 12 dive-bombed 3 obviously damaged ships, but not all the pilots found it necessary to use their missiles here. They searched the shores, went down to fly around the harbour at 50 feet above the water, seeking a target for their bombs. But now there were more bombs than targets. The fighter pilots found 3 Japanese float biplane fighters in the air. Quickly shooting them down, they too looked around for a target on which to use up their ammunition. They cruised out to sea, where they found a lone destroyer, sole surviving vessel of the entire concentration, making off under forced draft. The leading pair dived on the destroyer's anti-aircraft gun crews. Heavy bullets from the plane's .50 caliber machine guns cut down these men as they tried to run for cover. The second pair shot up the bridge. After that second attack, not a Japanese crewman or officer could be seen. All not annihilated must have been hiding below decks. Next, the fighters made runs in close to fire at the torpedo tubes, intending thus to put the fighting power of the destroyer out of action. Satisfied that this too was accomplished, the pilots began diving close to fire into the hull. They saw their hard-hitting armor piercing bullets apparently cut the thin hull and deck plates like butter. Then they systematically began to shoot into the vessel's boilers and machinery in the hope of completely disabling her. There were immediate results. The plunging destroyer began to slow down. Steam and smoke poured out of her hatches. Oil seeped out of the hundreds of tears in the hull where the slugs had ripped ragged holes. The planes returned to their carrier, but from this last raid not everyone got back. 2 fighters, for instance, noticing one of our torpedo planes, which had been sent out on an earlier raid, began to follow it. As their fuel tanks emptied, they realized the torpedo plane was going in the wrong direction and that all 3 were lost. Eventually, just before dusk, the 2 fighters flown by Ensigns Elbert S. McCuskey and a companion whose name I never was able to learn, arrived back at Guadalcanal and announced by radio that they were making forced landings on the southern shore. They settled their planes into a broad, boulder-strewn section of the beach which was washed by the surf. To cushion the shock, they put their landing wheels only halfway down, tightened their belts, and made the slowest possible stall landings into the shallow water. "We were able to walk away," McCuskey related weeks later when telling of the experience. "As a matter of fact, neither of us was hurt. We got out of the planes and waded ashore, to find ourselves surrounded by natives wearing only G-strings and armed with stone axes and knives made of human thigh bones. It looked like a tough spot. But those boys were friendly. It was getting dark, and we wanted a fire to signal a destroyer that might be sent for us. We could not talk to the natives, but with signs we made them understand what we wanted. The native warriors used the oldest known method for creating a blaze," the pilots went on. With grunts and groans attesting their efforts, they whirled a thin, pointed stick, whose tip was inserted in a hole in another stick. By revolving it at high speed between the palms of their hands, this friction cheated a spark. The spark was caught in half a coconut where a nest of shredded dried bark had been prepared. A few puffs and a blaze appeared, soon to be nursed into a roaring beach fire. We opened one of our parachutes and, using the cloth to screen the blaze from the sea, we sent Morse code signals, the ensign continued. Soon one of our destroyers was edging cautiously into the bay and launched a powerboat. Trying to destroy our planes was a tough job. We machine-gunned them, hoping to ignite the fuel tanks, but they were dry. Finally, we stripped the radio and other gear and smashed the instruments with rocks. We took the breech mechanisms out of our machine guns and carried them off, and finally, with all of our remaining ammunition for the submachine gun, shot up the planes. We were satisfied that the Japanese could find nothing of value in them, and we freely gave the wrecks to the natives who were overjoyed. The metal in the planes would be saved, every scrap of it, and used for knives, hooks, spearheads, and other purposes. It was a treasure trove for them, and we knew the tides would soon wreck anything they left. The airmen had several narrow escapes getting through the heavy surf to the destroyer's longboat, but finally made it. McCuskey went back ashore on a rope after having made it out to the boat once. His purpose was to damage the planes still further, but in the darkness the rope caught on the rocks and he was almost drowned before freeing himself from it and swimming ashore. Another man then took a second rope in, and both came off together. The torpedo plane pilot was Lieutenant Leonard E. Ewalt. He also made a forced landing in the sea near Guadalcanal when his fuel was exhausted. He had lost contact with the fighter planes and notified the carrier by radio that he was coming down some miles away. The destroyer which picked up McCuskey and his companion that night failed to locate Ewalt and his crewmen. Though the flyers had seen several Japanese ships sink during the day, They did not realize until later just how successful the day's attack had been at Tulagi. From shore watchers, whose reports came in later, it was learned that the following ships had been sunk: 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, 3 transports, one of approximately 20,000 tons, and 2 of about 10,000 tons, 1 seaplane tender, 4 gunboats, and 8 aircraft destroyed. 1 destroyer, the one shot up by our fighters, was given as severely damaged. The observer also added, "Few of the Japanese who were on the ships survived. Most of those who were not annihilated by the explosion of our heavy bombs aboard were drowned or otherwise failed to reach shore." By sinking 14 out of the 15 enemy ships found in Tulagi, our flyers again demonstrated that combined dive bombing and torpedo plane attack is the most certain, destructive and deadly method yet devised for attacking ships. Our own losses were merely 3 planes, 2 fighters and 1 torpedo plane. The 2 fighter pilots were back flying with their squadron next day. The official Navy communiques on the Battle of the Coral Sea speak of our forces there losing a destroyer and a tanker in the conflict. This is true only by the strictest possible interpretation of the facts. Here is the story, and you can draw your own conclusions. Our twin carrier striking force did not loiter after the action of May 4th. That night we turned southwest and steamed away from Tulagi just as hard as we had come up toward it the night before. This withdrawal was based on the sound military premise that secrecy and elusiveness is a prime requisite for all naval forces, but especially so for a barrier force which has great speed, that is, great mobility, and a long arm with tremendous hitting power that is its planes. "If they cannot find you, they cannot hit you," was Captain Sherman's maxim. The carrier is a weapon that can dash in, hit hard, and disappear. While maneuvering about the Coral Sea, we met the tanker United States ship Neosho, one of the big new fuel carriers built for the Navy. She had been launched in April 1939, after being authorized with similar craft by a Congressional Act of May 1938. The Neosho was commissioned on August 7, 1939. This vessel, 553 feet long with a displacement of 25,000 tons, was commanded by Captain John S. Phillips, United States Navy, and manned by a naval crew. Service aboard tankers is generally a non-fighting job, but it is one of the most dangerous branches of the Navy's fleets in wartime. Long-range naval operations depend on such tankers for meeting the fleet at sea to supply fuel, so allowing the fighting vessels to remain in action zones for long periods. The enemy knows this well, and tankers are always #1 targets. Furthermore, tankers supplying fuel to fighting fleets often must steam across vast expanses of sea with no escort at all, or with entirely inadequate protection. Worst of all, they must penetrate, as did the Neosho, deep into waters that are really an ocean, no man's land, where at any time an enemy might appear over the horizon. In the case of the Neosho, an escort was provided, the destroyer Sims, 1,570 tons, commissioned in August 1939. This trim little featherweight was named after the late Admiral William Sowden Sims, United States Navy, who commanded American naval forces operating in European waters from April 1917 to the end of World War I. The Sims skipper was Lieutenant Commander Wilford Milton Hyman. My meeting with the Neosho occurred in the early morning of May 5th. I rolled out of my bunk at dawn, the clang, 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 clang of that hinged steel flap on the flight deck just over my head awakening me as the first squadrons of scouts raced down the deck for their takeoffs. By the time I got topside, it was full daylight. The Neosho was alongside the Lexington already passing aboard mail and oil. The speed of the entire flotilla had eased down from the normal 20-knot clip because we were waiting for Carrier 2's fleet to rejoin us. There was a second tanker waiting around to oil Admiral Fletcher's flagship, Carrier 2, when it arrived. It was usual for new ships to arrive or leave the force, and this morning I noticed that in addition to the 2 oilers, 2 Australian cruisers had slipped in and joined us. The Neosho's arrival meant another chance to get some mail back home, and like everyone else on the Lexington, I seized the opportunity and beat out a series of dispatches covering the latest action. My stories went off with the confidential mail to the naval censors at Pearl Harbor. Naturally, I made use of every occasion to get dispatches back to my paper whenever I could. Although mine was a correspondence paradise, there was a thorn in my garden. I had to send my stories to the Navy without ever knowing what the censors did to them, whether they were annihilated, in toto, or whether they were going through untouched. In fact, I was never sure they were getting to Pearl Harbor or to the mainland at all. Being accustomed to work at the end of a cable where my office can send messages, queries, or condemnations in a matter of a few hours, it was trying to go suddenly to sea and find oneself cut off completely. I could not even cable, "Dear editor, am I still with you?" Nevertheless, the dispatches had to go regardless of how long it might take for them to reach their destination. The good feature of the whole thing was that there was no other correspondent with any of the ships in the fleet, therefore I could not be scooped. I paid no particular attention to the Neo show. First, I was busy writing most of that morning. Next, even while the Neo show was linked to us by oil pipes, she was too far away to carry on any conversation with her officers or crew, except through a megaphone. Of course, there was a telephone connection from our bridge to theirs, but that was for Navy business. We idly watched her crew moving about on deck, examining the hose connections frequently to see that they had not loosened, or working on the anti-aircraft guns she carried. Some were swabbing down the decks or painting, a never-ending chore on all Navy ships at sea. Many of them had stripped off their shirts and were sunbaking as they worked. When the Neo show finally pushed off to oil other ships in the fleet, none of us realized what these men were going to be subjected to in the near future. The Sims had been with our striking force for some days, and late that afternoon, when the Neo show's capacious hull tanks had been drained, the two turned out of the fleet formation and started southeast. From there on, they were on their own, and were no longer connected with our carrier forces. Neither of them expected to have any further part in the coralsea actions. They were homeward bound, and probably the crews were anticipating short shore leaves on their arrival. The next we heard from them was on the morning of May 7th. It was a radio message from the Neo show saying that they had been attacked by Japanese aircraft. The Sims had been sunk, and the Neo show had been hit several times, but Lieutenant Commander Hyman reported she would float indefinitely, although she could not steam. The attack had occurred at a point several hundred miles from us, for following our parting, the Neo show was going east while we were headed west. The disaster overtook them some 36 hours after they had left us. More messages continued to come in. We learned that the Japanese planes were from an aircraft carrier, probably from one of the 3 carriers in the Japanese's second striking prong that had come down from Truk and into the Coral Sea behind us. It is very likely that this carrier was one of those we sank in the great battle on May 8th, when our 2 carriers met and defeated this powerful fleet. It seemed that the Sims had been quickly sunk by a bomb that landed squarely on her fantail, after deck. The Neo show, however, although hit several times by bombs and torpedoes, stayed afloat because her tanks were empty, and the buoyancy of those which were not holed acted as watertight compartments. The derelict nevertheless managed to pick up some of the Sims' survivors. Others floated away on rafts which they could neither propel nor control. The sinking occurred at a point so far away from our position that the Navy dispatched a warship from a different and nearer area to their rescue. When it arrived, it took off all the men found on the still-floating hunk, and then sank what was left of the Neo show. A search in this general area was made for the Sims' rafts, but I never have been able to learn how many were picked up. Technically, I suppose, these 2 were lost in the Battle of the Coral Sea, but actually these sinkings were very remote from us. Also, they were not taken from under the eyes of our aircraft or our protection. The morning of the 5th, to return to our own story of that date, was bright and clear except for occasional patches of cloud and haze several thousand feet above us. These thickened into a solid overcast by afternoon, and made the tasks of our scouts more difficult than ordinarily in these latitudes. Carrier 2 was approaching her rendezvous with us, and our own scouts were flying a wide umbrella around both ships. Suddenly, over the Lexington's radio, we heard the voice of Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Flatley, skipper of the fighter squadron of Carrier 2. He was calling his own carrier from the air to report a gangster. A few seconds later, we heard his voice again, identifying the plane as a Kawanishi, the 4-motor Japanese flying boat that is apparently their favorite craft for long-range scouting. We could see neither Flatley nor the Japanese, both being above the cloud level. At this point, the Lexington's fighter director, Lieutenant Red Gill, broke in to ask Flatley, "Where is the Kawanishi?" Gil was asking the question so he could direct his own fighters toward the Japanese. "Wait a minute, and I will show him to you," Flatley replied. I was in the fighter control room and ran up the steel ladder to the signal bridge to see what would happen. Everyone else on the deck and bridge was peering and trying to see the scrap which we knew was taking place somewhere above. For about a minute there was nothing to see except the featureless cloud base. Then suddenly there was a glow in the clouds like a ball of fire. It increased, and then there popped out of the vapour a huge plane, spinning madly and burning like a torch. The fire seemed to grow in intensity even as we watched it fall. It hit the water almost in the middle of the fleet and instantly exploded. There was a big flash of flame, and then nothing but a huge pillar of black smoke. Jimmy had called his shot and delivered for the whole fleet to see. So quickly had all this happened that none of us realized we had just seen a dozen Japanese die a horrible death. A strange thing about airplanes when they crash. Somehow you have the feeling that it is the plane that is dying, not the men within it. In this case, not one of the crew made any attempt to bail out. And strangely enough, never once in all that sea fighting did any of our pilots see a Japanese airman take to his parachute. We speculated many times on the possibility that perhaps Japanese sea fighters do not carry parachutes. We know their land planes do, because we have seen photographs of Japanese army crews lined up ready to go into the air, and invariably these men would be wearing their chutes and chute harness. Maybe they do not give them parachutes so they cannot be saved, become prisoners, and give military information, some of our flyers suggested. We know they have got the silk to make them if they wanted to, another young ensign speculated. But maybe they have sent all their silk to the Germans in exchange for engines and planes, or perhaps they sold it all to us before the war opened. A few seconds after the Kawanishi hit the water, we could hear Flatley's voice again. This time he was ribbing the Lexington's fighter pilots. "A fine thing when we have to come over here and shoot these fellows down from on top of you. Why don't you keep your own nose clean?" A minute later we heard Lieutenant Noel Gaylor from our own fighter squadron call Flatley. He said, "That one nearly fell on top of me, Jimmy." I was climbing up through those clouds, and when that ball of fire swept past me, I could not make out for a minute what it was. "That will teach you not to fly underneath me. It is a dangerous place to be with Japanese around. The air beneath me is always full of falling Japanese," Jimmy cracked back. Later I talked to Gaylor aboard ship. You cannot imagine the surprise I got. I was flying through the cloud, climbing and not saying nothing to no one when this big burning Kawanishi came across in front of me. It disappeared before I recognized what it was, but I will tell you it gave me a start for a minute. Although Gaylor did not say so, it was really a close affair. If that big Japanese boat had clipped Gaylor's plane, it would have meant curtains. Flatley knew this as well as Gaylor, but as long as it had not happened, he was prepared to tease him about it. I had a talk that night with Commander Mort Seligman, the Lexington's executive, who is a long-time flying man himself. Seligman's duties on the Lexington prevented him from joining her air squadrons, but he took part in the pilot meetings and in the discussions of air strategy that forever were underway in the wardroom. "We are under a handicap out here. The limited range of our scouts makes it necessary for us to be forever on our toes. If we want to find out what the enemy is doing, we have got to move up to within easy range of his land-based aircraft to find out," Seligman said. "On the other hand, the Japanese, by using these 3,000-mile Kawanishi boats, can see a lot farther than we can. They range out over the ocean and watch every movement within some 1,000 miles of their bases. There is little we do in daylight that they cannot know about. It costs them a plane every so often because we shoot them down every time we come across them. But with these clouds out here, this is not always possible because even though we know they are there, we cannot always find them. Once their day patrols have come out and they know their waters are clear for 500 miles around, they can relax. Even if they find us, they have time to bring up air defences before we can get in our poke. That limits our attacks almost to early morning, only after an all-night fast approach, and it makes it very difficult for us to gain the advantage of the element of surprise, which is a much more important factor in war than most people realize. Positions were reversed in the Midway battles, we have since seen. Our own long-range flying boats from Midway spotted the enemy's occupation forces while they were still 700 miles out, and were able to attack them and turn them aside before they got anywhere near their objective. Usually, after dinner, A number of the officers would gather in front of a huge map of the Pacific that was blown up to cover one end of the wardroom lounge. They would discuss ways and means, possibilities and prospects of the war against the Japanese. This was an almost nightly topic. Almost everyone who was not playing checkers, bridge, or acey-deucey would come over and put in an oar. The main question always was, how can we get at the Japanese? And invariably the ideas flew thick and fast, and the pros and cons were thrashed back and forth. None of us naturally had any idea what the High Command had in its program, nor the strength of men and weapons available for the job. But there were certain obvious factors which everybody understood. We knew where the Japanese were, and we knew what the problems of digging them out amounted to. The main Japanese base was the island of Truk in the Central Pacific. This is protected against a frontal advance from Hawaii by the long chain of the Gilbert and Marshall Islands, continuing northward to the islands of Wake, Marcus, and on to Tokyo. They had also moved southward and were busy converting Rabaul into a southern bastion to protect Truk. Their efforts to move into the Solomons to cover the southward approach had for the time being been frustrated by our shattering attack on Tulagi, but no one on the ship was deluded into thinking that this was more than a temporary setback. The Japanese occupations of Lai and Salamaua not only were advance bases from which Australia could be attacked, but also were outposts to protect Rabaul. The Japanese use of aircraft knit this widely flung island network into a strong chain, which they hoped would halt any moves we made. Any open attack from the south toward Truk would be subject to flank attacks by land-based planes and submarines from the Marshalls or Rabaul. In these informal, endless discussions, many agreed with my speculation that Rabaul was a key post, and the first step in breaking the chain was to take it. Invasion and occupation of Rabaul would provide 1. An advanced base of operations against Truk, and 2. Would remove the enemy in the area of New Guinea. It was the consensus of opinion that Lae and Salamaua were only satellites of Rabaul, which would automatically fall, or the forces there would be withdrawn once Rabaul had fallen. After taking Rabaul, the next move would be to invest Truk. Success here would dry up supplies for the enemy in the Gilbert and Marshall Islands, thus dropping them into our laps like ripe plums. Instead of being untenable for us, Wake Island would be easily taken and thereafter supported from the same bases that the Japanese now use for its support. Japan would therefore be forced to fight from behind her inner island defences: Tokyo, Marcus, the Marianas, Guam, Yap, Peleliu, Amboina, and Timor. Our wardroom strategists, with this attractive picture before them, then invariably would get down to brass tacks on how to capture Rabaul. While we conceded that air raids served the purpose of destroying supplies, ships, defences, and aircraft on the ground, and generally delayed the Japanese in their strengthening of the base, an all-out offensive would require occupation forces. We would need several transports full of troops trained as the Marines are for amphibious operations. We would also need at least 4 carriers, supporting vessels and the cooperation of General MacArthur's air forces based in northern Australasia. We pictured the offensive as opening with 3 or 4 sustained, day-long air bombardments of the enemy airfields in these areas by MacArthur's big bombers. During this time, the carriers, followed by their occupation transports, would move up into positions offshore. These carriers would be specially equipped with a preponderance of fighter planes, so that they could take command of the sky when they slipped in on the 4th or 5th day after the bombardment began. As soon as the bombardment had taken a serious enough toll, the invasion forces would be shoved ashore with the assistance of some 6- and 8-inch gun cruisers and dive bombers as artillery support. The bridgehead would be chosen in a suitable position so that these ground troops could seize as quickly as possible 1 or more aerodromes. The carriers would still be in the area to take care of any enemy fleet that was rushed down and to put ashore strong fighter plane forces. At the same time, the army could fly in with bombers, troop transports, fighters, and the full equipment of a modern airborne army. Whether this is ever done at Rabaul or not, the wardroom would agree as the picture grew in the minds of the men discussing it, that this is the method that will eventually be used against the Japanese when we begin to wrest back from them some of the territory they overran so swiftly in the opening months of the war. Since the time of these conversations, the Japanese have been seeping into the Solomons and the Louisiade and have built further advanced bases from which to protect approaches to Rabaul. The problem is today even more difficult than it was back in the first week of May, when these discussions were taking place. May 6th was a dull day as far as action was concerned. The tropic sun was beating down with fierce heat. Our scouts at this time were coming back from their patrols with faces and necks deeply tanned. Their flying goggles or sunglasses protected their eyes, parts of their foreheads and the tops of their cheeks. The result was, when they took their goggles off, they appeared to be wearing white masks, so great was the contrast between the tanned lower half of their faces and the unpigmented upper skin. We were heading northward, and our scouts were working out at extreme ranges, and those to the north of us were scouring the Louisiade archipelago. The Louisiades, a collection of islands and reefs, are flung out from the southeastern tip of New Guinea for a distance of 200 miles. With the exception of Panatinani, Tagula, Rossel, and Missima, the islands are small. Of those named, the three latter are high and mountainous. The main portion of the group is encircled by a barrier reef which is bisected by numerous passages, while Rossel, where the cruiser pilots spent their 18 days, is surrounded by a separate reef of considerable extent, according to the Pacific Islands sailing directions for New Guinea. A large portion of this archipelago has been unsurveyed, and navigation in its vicinity is attended with some risk, according to the Hydrographic Office reports. The largest island is Tagula, 60 square miles in area. Only a few whites live in the islands, maintaining themselves, chiefly by carrying on desultory trading with the natives for copra. There also are a few prospectors on Tagula who bring in a little gold for their efforts. Missima is mountainous and densely wooded. It is about 21 miles long, lies in an east-west direction, and is 5 miles wide at its eastern end, the point of greatest extremity. Important gold reefs, which were discovered in 1905, were being worked on a large scale by American interests up to this time. We dug out the sailing directions in anticipation of passing along the southern side of these islands, and before the day was over, we found a more immediate interest in it. During the afternoon, a scout flying near Deboyne Island, one of the group, saw 15 or 16 enemy ships, among them warships and transports. They were concentrated in the lagoon there, and another scout who had been even further north had an even more electrifying report. He said that far north of Missima he had seen an enemy force similar to ours. It was comprised of 2 aircraft carriers, 5 cruisers, and at least a dozen destroyers, and was moving slowly southward, approaching the Louisiade. Evidently, Admiral Fletcher decided to go after this force, for with the coming of darkness, he swung slightly to the northeastward and steered toward Rossel once again. About the time we changed course, he detached the 2 Australian cruisers and 1 American cruiser to take up a position at the southern end of the Jomard Passage, where they could stand guard in case the Japanese at Deboyne tried to slip into the Coral Sea during the night. Our suspicion that Admiral Fletcher intended to attack in the morning was justified when all flight personnel were called into conference after dinner. Photographic copies of the charts of these islands were given to every pilot, and detailed instructions were gone over by the squadron commanders with their men in preparation for attacking these enemy carriers, as soon as our scouts relocated them in the morning. These talks were brief because the men knew exactly what had to be done and the favoured tactics for doing it. As soon as the conferences broke up, they sat around in small groups, animatedly talking of the coming fight, a brand new subject because it was their first opportunity for an attack on a carrier. Also, they knew they were going to meet up with the much-talked-of Japanese Zero, single-seater fighter, the next morning for the first time. From the tables came remarks like these: "Don't forget now, no dogfighting with these babies. I think if we stick to our pair combinations, we should be able to handle them. What do you suppose their performance really is like?" The boys had heard that the Zero was outmanoeuvring the P-40s in Burma and at Port Moresby. A lot of ex-Navy pilots were flying with the American volunteer group, and some of the officers in our force were getting letters from friends with the Flying Tigers. The scout pilots, who also fight in pairs, were faced with the problem of relocating the enemy fleet in the morning, and expected they might run into the Zeros in their slow, less manoeuvrable planes. The dive bombers and torpedo plane pilots also were interested in the Zeros because they had never been up against these craft in earlier actions. They knew what our plans for defense of the Lexington called for and anticipated that the Japanese too would have a fighter plane screen around their fleet. The refrain heard again and again was, "No matter how well you shot before, baby, it is how straight you are tomorrow that counts." Lieutenant Commander Ramsay, the man with the mustachio, was getting a fair bit of ribbing from the boys. One of them was saying, "I will lend you my scissors, Paul, to clip that moustache. You ought to get 5 anyway. That will let you cut one side off." "I would like to see you come out from under that spinach," another said. "I have forgotten what you look like when shaven clean." Paul, who was a checker expert and interested at that moment only in trading his opponent, Lieutenant Moore, 1 man for 4, merely looked up, grinned broadly, and raised his expressive eyebrows mischievously. By 10 o'clock these flyers had turned into rest in preparation for an early takeoff in the morning. Though the men fully realized the danger they would face in another few hours, they slept as peacefully as they would have at home. I know they slept. I saw them through the ever-open cabin doors. There was no nervousness, and there was no obvious tension. They were in for a fight, they knew it, and they were prepared. All night long the flotilla knifed its way at 25 knots northward. There was moonlight and brilliant starlight from the Milky Way, now and then obscured by big floating clouds of the sort never seen outside the tropics. I went up to the flight deck and looked out to see the fleet drawn in close together. It was a wonderful sight, one I will never forget. Sliding along as we were, all ships holding the same fast clip and never varying for an instant their relative position, gave me a sudden realization of the immense forces exerted to drive all these ships through the black waters. As I looked across at one or another, I could see its outline chiefly through the white bone in the teeth and the phosphorescence of its wake. Now and again dim light signals were exchanged between the Lexington and a cruiser, or a cruiser and destroyer, as we zigzagged onward. Going below finally, I dropped into the wardroom and had a cup of coffee with the Padre, Lieutenant Commander C.L. Markle, before we turned in ourselves.